the word folk that you just used makes me uncomfortable.
Oh, the word folk. I'm sorry.
Herder. Yeah, that comes from Herder, which is a German nationalist.
Holy shit. This is James Lindsay concern trolling in 4K. He's so bad at it too.
And as far as sort of structures, again, you're making a connection between structures in terms of...
Okay, I have seen this part, obviously, like the rest of you. This is the viral moment where everyone's like, holy shit. I didn't know the build up to this. Once you have the lore, I appreciate this so much more as this just like beautiful tail end of the entire interview, knockout punch. Because it's just like, you had to sit there and deal with this absolute man baby. All right, let's see, James Lindsay.
Welcome back to Black News Tonight. Republicans have been on the offensive against concepts like critical race theory and white privilege, concepts that they believe attack fundamental American values, patriotism, and ultimately against freedom of speech and expression. In fact, there's a new cheat sheet making its rounds in conservative circles. Fortunately, we at BNC got our hands on it. It was made by a trio of authors from the Oregon Association of Scholars. It was recently published, and it was made for policymakers, and it was entitled
I remember when we first, I think this was my first introduction to James Lindsay. Not this debate, although I have seen some of the clips and highlights of it, but was this this printout.
Responding to social justice rhetoric. It identifies 12 social justice terms and describes their, quote, intended and true meanings as understood by the authors, of course. So, for example, when they say systemic racism, this is their words, what they mean is differences are always due to systems, which is an attribution of group differences to vague, quote unquote, systems imposed by others, and an attempt to dismantle freedoms and forcibly redistribute public and private goods. That's a heck of a interpretation. And that's why we're very excited to have our guests on who will talk about why they believe social justice rhetoric curtails freedom of speech and diversity of thought. I have with me now two of the three authors of the cheat sheet, Drs. Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay. Thank you both for joining me. Let's just get right.
Wait, is it pronounced Lindsay? It's not Lindsay? I'm going with Lindsay.
To it. How does social
Lindsay.
Justice rhetoric curtail freedom of speech?
Well, the rhetoric around social justice itself doesn't necessarily curtail anything, but the application of that rhetoric is very chilling. It leads people to believe that they're going to be accused.
He has this perpetual look on his face, and I just realized it now that he's poisoned you in a video game, and like he's waiting for you to pick an option or something like that. Like he always looks so worried.
Of participating and supporting or being complicit in racism, sexism, misogyny, etc., for voicing views that differ from the views of the people who forward what is known as critical social justice specifically, which is just one of many approaches to social justice in the understanding of making things more fair and less discriminatory and prejudiced in society.
Can you give me an example of that, of something that curbs freedom of speech?
Yeah, sure. Like, for example, we're not allowed to call the thing we plug into our computer anymore a master drive, or we're not allowed to talk about a master bedroom or a master bathroom because it can sometimes make some people feel as though that those words are somehow connected.
Wait, that's never happened before. Shut the fuck up. What are you talking about? What a clown. Oh, excuse me. Is that a master drive or a hard drive? A hard drive reminds me of erections. You can't use that either, okay? That's definitely anti-SJW.
To slavery, even though that's not the case. And so some people can then say, well, that word makes me feel uncomfortable, and then I don't want to have that at work. So you see major corporations, for example, deciding, well, we're not going to use the terms like master slave drive.
Wait. Slave drive. He's making this up, isn't he? Did he see this like on a cereal box? What's happening?
Or master bedroom being struck down from realtor websites, for example. And if you don't know, by the way, the master bedroom term originated in a Sears catalog in 1929, which is quite a long time after slavery ended, so it wasn't actually
He's not making this up, it's real? No. Not that those are the names, that people are outraged at this, that they're centering the discussion of racism and prejudice and like how it's limiting the speech of James Lindsay and other people. Like none of that is true. That's utter and complete nonsense.
connected to that. That turns out to be a legend. And not even real, but you can see how
no, that's why I'm laughing. That's why this is ridiculous. I understand that these are the names for the devices. I've never heard of someone like legitimately, unironically be like, well, yes, I had my speech limited. I wanted to put in my master drive. Oh my God, I've said, I'm sorry. I didn't want to commit hate speech. I didn't want to say a slur live on the air, but I wanted to put in my drive. And at the time, I said, could you please hand it to me? And the person in the store actually said that I had committed a hate crime. And it was at that moment that I knew my life was going to change forever. And I was fired from my job. And everyone knows that I'm basically as racist as Adolf Hitler now. It happened. It's a true story.
Accused of racism is leading even significant corporations to back off from using that language. So the curtailing of the willingness to speak is certainly present within that ideology.
So he's making up the outrage, but the language in the tech industry is changing. Yeah, that's fine. That's not limiting anyone's free speech. If you evolve language or change the names for things, and it doesn't even have to be because of racially sensitive reasons. It can just be for any reason. But that doesn't like James Lindsay can still walk into a hardware store whenever he wants and just say the words master drive as many times as he wants. No one's going to stop him. He can run around. Like, you can take this to their logical conclusions. No one's stopping James Lindsay from saying anything in any kind of capacity.
Let me push back against that, and Peter, I want you to jump in as well. I mean, it doesn't sound to me as if this is curbing free speech. It's simply imposing consequences on free speech, and there have always been consequences on free speech. If I, for example, continue to say a master-slave relationship with disk drives, right, which we all used to do, at least back in the day when we actually had disk drives, and it makes someone uneasy, they may respond differently. If I continue to sell my bedroom furniture as master bedroom furniture, and people say, well, you know, it makes us uneasy, and so we don't want to sell it here. These are market-based consequences, but people have a right to still do it. It seems to me that sometimes the right conflates two things. They take consequences and accountability, and they conflate it with freedom. They act as if because people respond to their words or respond to their actions in particular ways, that they're no longer free to do it.
Okay, so there are two principles. There is the philosophical principle of free speech, and then there is the legal principle of free speech. And so you're appealing to the legal principle, which is of course upheld, except that the problem becomes that the philosophical notion of free speech.
That's the part you're deeply worried about. Yeah, but it's about the philosophy. It's about what people may think. I mean, people might think bad things of me. I walk into a store and I just start calling everyone the N-word, and it's the philosophy of the issue, really. Like, why are people going to impose their morals on me?
The idea that somebody's going to be able to speak without consequences is, of course, ridiculous. But the idea that somebody's going to be able to speak without having to risk losing their job or losing their standing in society for something that is actually fairly benign, for example, brown bag lunch. It's a completely benign thing, or a thing that nobody even seems to know has a not even really racist connotation in its past from over 100 years ago, a long time no.
But you're saying all these things that no one uses in English much anymore. I can't remember the last time I thought of the fact that it was called master slave drive or whatever. Like that thought has never entered my head. I wouldn't say like, can you pass me a brown bag lunch? I would be like, can you pass me that bag or lunch? Like, why? Like, these are weird expressions that aren't used. This is a non-problem.
Translation from the Chinese. The idea that we're going to chill the way that people speak and that they can then lead to situations in which they're being mobbed.
I think you're adding steps. You're like, they are controlling me and they are controlling my speech, philosophically speaking. Legally, I know it's ridiculous and utterly absurd, and I know I would be laughed out of room, but philosophically speaking, I can no longer call this something that is apparently considered to be racist now. I have to add a few words to do that. There's some extra steps. I could just say lunch bag, you know, like a normal human. Like most people pass me the lunch bag. I can't, like, what? No one talks like this, James Lindsay.
On social media and losing their livelihood because they don't necessarily have free speech under their employer. That's a really concerning development in society, and it's one that we actually should be taking seriously, especially since we're having extremism stand-downs, for example, in the U.S. military, and we're seeing this kind of stuff taught in schools, which is being done by the state.
And one of the, if I may, Mark, piggyback off of that.
Please.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. One of the reasons that we made this, and I genuinely thank you for reaching out to us, is to make ease of translation. And so the first author, I wish he could be here with us tonight, is Bruce Gilley. And a very
you don't get to be like, hey, come on, we wanted to make a cheat sheet just so we could easily explain things to people and let everyone know what these concepts mean. And it's like, yeah, but that's not at all what they mean. I don't think you understand these concepts. I think you need to learn these concepts.
quick correction from the beginning of the segment. I am not a member of the Oregon Association of Scholars, neither is Dr. Lindsay, it's just Dr. Gilley. One of the reasons that we made this cheat sheet was for policymakers, so when they heard a certain term, they could translate it into another term in their head so they could understand what people are actually saying, given that the meanings of these words have changed significantly.
So, and again, I have a couple of pushbacks here. The first one to the latter point, or the former point rather, which is, you know, again, there have always been consequences to behavior. People have always lost their jobs for things that they've said. The difference is now in the 21st century, there's a movement to say, look, things that can get you fired aren't just things that harm certain groups of people, but things that may do harm to other groups of people. Now suddenly race is in the conversation. Trans folk are in the conversation. Women are in the conversation. Issues around ability status are in the conversation.
The word folk makes me uncomfortable. The word folk comes from the Herderian nationalism. The word folk that you just used makes me uncomfortable.
Oh, the word folk, I'm sorry.
Herder. Yeah, that comes from Herder, which is a German nationalist.
Holy shit. This is James Lindsay concern trolling in 4K. He's so bad at it too. He's still so awkward and still looks like he's worried. The poison hasn't taken effect yet. It's like, excuse me. I'm very concerned about what you're saying.
He used it spelled with a V, but it's pronounced folk, right? And he had a strong German nationalist streak. And he his ideology about nationalism and folkish ideology led to some pretty bad things in the early 20th century. And I'm kind of uncomfortable with you using that word. So should your speech now be curtailed because I'm uncomfortable with the word folk?
Yeah. Wait, but might I say, philosophically speaking, of course, anything else would be kind of ridiculous and absurd, right?
In this context.
Jim, if you don't mind me calling you.
It should?
Jim, if you don't mind me calling you Jim, I would say I receive that. I own that. Mm-hmm. I deeply apologize for it. If there's a way that I can restore, engage in a restorative act to make you feel better about it, I would happily do so.
I don't need a restorative act. I'm just telling you that you should know the history of the word that you're using.
I agree. I'm agreeing with you. I'm saying I should. And if there's something I can do to make sure that other people know it, I'm happy to do that as well. I think that is exactly what we should do when our words do harm.
Not folkish, ISH, but folkish. The German folkish. Do you know where the ideology went in Germany? Do you know where that led to?
Right. So again, an example that you're getting, just so that we don't get too far down this rabbit hole. I'm saying, with what you're saying,
I mean, that's ridiculous. He thinks this is a gotcha. Like, and he's genuinely like, in the most worried of ways, just like, I can't wait later on social media to show this off to all my many fans. James Lindsay bodied another lib.
Saying this is exactly what I would argue should happen. You should point something out. I should be able to respond to it. And even though you're doing it somewhat tongue-in-cheek, potentially, but I'll presume that you're doing this in good faith. I would say I would happily change my speech and model it for other people. And that's the problem, is that somehow when the left does that toward the right, or toward white people around race, or toward men around gender, we often don't want to do that. And that's where it gets very, very troublesome for me. But the second issue that I have here, and we can talk about it, I'm going to hold you guys over because I'd love to finish this conversation, is that some of the ways that you all are representing how social justice rhetoric is being used, I think is inaccurate. There's ways that you all are framing this that are almost caricatures of what people are actually saying in progressive circles. So I don't want to...
Volk is just the German word for people. It's still the modern German word for people. Well, yeah. Again, James Lindsay is not really good at anything he does. Even if he's trying to concern troll, he can't even do that well.
don't want to throw one out there and make people wait. So let me just pause here just so we can take a commercial break.
Okay. Okay.
And then you can come back and we can have the whole conversation. I just don't want to cut you off. I want to give you a full sentence.
Oh,
everybody stay with us. I have some great people. I said people here with me. And we're going to have a great conversation
it would appear
with these human beings.
I scored a victory.
Stay with us. News tonight. I've been having a wonderful conversation here around these questions of rhetoric, this question of language when it comes to social justice. And I have two guests here, Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, who have been engaging me in a conversation about whether or not these are legitimate spaces to engage, or rather, what legitimate engagement looks like with questions of social justice language. So I want to keep the conversation going. Peter, you were going to say something. I wanted to give you an opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. So when Jim said that and you gave your response, I would like to give the identical response that you gave to our sheet. So if there's something that's unfair or we've mischaracterized something, I'd invite people to tell us and to have that conversation with us. And we're completely willing to revise or revamp. In fact, we've said repeatedly that this is a first iteration. And if you go to the site, actually Jim's site, New Discourses, and you call me Pete or Peter, either one.
That's why you were invited.
If you go to New Discourses, you can see each of those words are sourced within the social justice literature. So we didn't just invent this stuff. We took the words as they were used from the social justice literature. And if we've made a mistake, then I'll fully apologize for that and revise accordingly.
So who wrote the literature in question? Oh, it was black people. Oh, okay. So I guess we'll call that genre social justice literature then. Okay, yeah, sure, yeah, that checks out.
All right, so let's look at a couple of the things here. This is one of the things that I find interesting. So under systemic racism, you say when people, progressives, I'm just going to use progressives if you don't mind. When you say progressives say, or social justice people, say differences are always due to systems, right? That's not the argument. When we say that there's systemic racism, the argument has never been that every single thing that happens in the world is due to systems. There's always been a relationship between structures or systems and agency, human action. And all of the research literature, all the philosophy, all the theory has been about trying to find a balance and trying to make sense of the relationship between those two things. We're not robots walking through the world. We have choices, we have options. No race theorist argues that we don't. And so the idea here that systemic racism is just some kind of institutional blame game, I think, becomes a kind of caricature of it. I'm going to say one more, and then I want to give you two a chance to respond here. You said that critical race theory says that is the view that all disparities in group outcomes are due to racist systems, right? Again, no. I mean, one of the most enduring, if not the most enduring term from critical race theory has been intersectionality. And so when we look at people like Kimberly Crenshaw and others who talk about the intersections of race and gender and geography and ability status, I think it's wholly inaccurate to suggest that everything, even in critical race theory, is chalked up to race. How would you respond to those two criticisms?
I mean, the intersectionality one's actually very easy to respond to. Yeah, of course, she's talking about other intersecting systems of power, but all of these systems of power are said to work the same way. And you mentioned structural, so I'm very glad you did that, because structural refers to, in this case, one of two things: language, as in structuralism, as interpreted through postmodernism, which means that we are actually products of our contingent.
I can't get over how he always looks worried, and I don't think he's nervous to be here. I think he's smug and happy with his performance so far, and I think he thinks he scored like a huge get for his cause. But like he's got perpetual, I don't know, worried about something. Something's about to go down. You know, I mean, whenever something does go down, they can always go back to, like, if there's a crowd of people and then pan over, like, whoa, that guy saw it coming from a mile away. He was pretty nervous looking.
of our culture and times, which therefore means that we don't actually have agency, that because we are actually just socialized into the conditions that we're in, and we mistake that which we think is true when it's actually just manifestations of those systems of power. It's also can refer to the structures of society in a Marxian superstructure way, like Karl Marx, as put forth, say, by Herbert Marcuse in the 1960s, father of the New Left, who talked about the fact that everybody who doesn't have a critical awakened consciousness, in other words, everybody who's not a critical theorist, whether it's critical race, critical gender, queer.
By the way, if you didn't already know this about James Lindsay, he's kind of fascinating in the lore of right-wing ghouls, because unlike a lot of the people who talk about Marxism, it clearly shows that he has read it. He just doesn't understand it. And so it's really neat that he takes all these like buzzwords, phrases, sentences, and he just pulls them right out of the books, and then he applies them to his own desires to paint a narrative. So he's got this his own vision of it. He wants it to be about Gnosticism and about the rejection of God and all this other kind of stuff. So he grabs all the words and terms you'll find in like the Communist Manifesto or Das Kapital, and then he inserts them to fit his narrative. So that's why he's pretty unique. Like there's not a lot of other people, and because of it, he comes across as academic. Like obviously anyone with 2 seconds of understanding of any of these concepts is like, whoa, what? You're just saying the words on the page. You're not actually explaining the ideas behind them.
Disability, critical fat, whatever you want to have it, is actually just being influenced in his thought through the heteronymous interests of corporate capital.
Oh yeah, he's a mathematician. He's a math academic, and that's why he applies a lot of those principles and how he analyzes things.
And consumerism and the various systems of power, including racism, sexism, etc., that manifest throughout society. So actually, we don't have agency under critical race theory or any of its philosophical antecedents.
That's correct.
They claim that you
I wish we had more time to unpack
your critical theorist, which is an incredible irony because you actually have to sacrifice all of your agency to think otherwise, which is how it chills freedom of thought and freedom of speech, because you have to be critically conscious,
he's
or else
getting
you have
smug in real time.
Therefore not
mid-sentence smugness
yourself. You have no actual agency.
Okay, so, and of course we're running out of time, but I'm going to respond just so the audience and the people who watch this on clips don't think that I don't have a response. First of all, your counter is predicated on the idea that there's a one-to-one relationship between critical race theory and critical theory as sort of produced from the Marxist tradition, from the Frankfurt School, etc., when in fact, critical race theory has certainly connections to any kind of critical intellectual discourse, but it's also connected to critical legal studies, which was not committed to sort of inheriting all of the kind of Gramscian and Marxian sort of ideas that you're talking about. And again, even the type of Marxism you're talking about is a very narrow, thin, sort of crude Marxism, or even what we call vulgar Marxism, which alleges a relationship between economic base and cultural superstructure that is one-to-one, when in fact, what most Marxists have argued, and what certainly most Marxists post the mid part of the 20th century have argued, is that it's a much more complicated dynamic than even Gramsci himself argues.
I mean, it's just one of those beautiful moments. Like, you've done the reading, sir. You know what you're talking about. And it's such a refreshing difference between the two. You can tell.
In the prison notebooks about this idea of hegemony and how it happens along a compromise equilibrium, whereby some people, or whereby on the one hand, we absolutely are hostage to the economic conditions around us, but on the other hand, structures and states and institutions also appeal to our own desires and our own interests and our own needs. It's a much more dynamic and complicated relationship than you're talking about. And as far as sort of structures, again, you're making a connection between structures in terms of...
Okay, I have seen this part, obviously, like the rest of you. This is the viral moment where everyone's like, holy shit, I didn't know the build up to this. Once you have the lore, I appreciate this so much more as this just like beautiful tail end of the entire interview, knockout punch. Because it's just like, you had to sit there and deal with this absolute fucking man baby, you know, this worried man baby the whole time. He's like, actually, I would prefer if you don't say folk. I find folk offensive because it originates from a German word Volk, which of course you know about the Nazis, right? The Nazis. To like, oh shit, he knows what he's talking about. He's not only read it, he understands it. He knows the words. Superstructure. I'm hearing it on a fucking mainstream show. Sweet.
Institutional structures that I was talking about, and the particular type of structures that, say, a Saussure would be talking about in terms of structuralism. That's not actually what I was talking about. And that's not what most people are talking about when they talk about systems and structures. Again, that's a very tight correlation you draw, and if we were to accept that correlation, then sure. But it's not only that we're not accepting it, it's actually not what we're talking about. And postmodernism, again, plays upon a range of things. I'm sorry?
Oh, it's so much more beautiful now. Oh, the candy is sweeter. Yes, yes. Oh my! This is 100% the Mary Poppins effect. Okay, we needed a few spoonfuls of sugar to help the medicine go down. So we had to take the medicine first. Unfortunately, the order is out. It's a reverse Mary Poppins. We had all this medicine and we're like jacked up on medicine, and all of a sudden it's like, and now you get your sugar. Now you get your 2 spoons of sugar. You know, right at the very end. It's like, oh, that sugar is sweet. That is the sweet. Fuck yes.
I said, you know a lot about this, actually. That you know a very large amount about this, very much detail. And so I have a question for you then. Do you accept, for example, in Critical Race Theory and Introduction, which is a pretty standard textbook in the subject, I think you would agree, do you accept where they have an entire section and part of a chapter dedicated to the idea that there is structural determinism along the structure of racism? Do you believe in structural determinism, which is a core assumption of critical race theory? That the structures themselves determine outcomes based on race.
Structures shape outcomes. They overdetermine outcomes. They inform outcomes, but they do not predetermine outcomes in such a way that we have no power, that we have no ability to change systems or structures. If that were the case, then we would have a very predictable, what we would sort of a pathway towards some ultimate telos, some ultimate end in society. In other words, I believe that human beings have the capacity to change and shift and push back and reimagine and reshape. And that's what I think your analysis doesn't do. We got way more academic than I wanted to for this audience. But unfortunately, if I don't respond in that way, then the audience will assume that I can't. So I'm going to bring you all back so we can have a much longer conversation about this. And maybe we can do it in some other spaces where we can really dig down and drill down into this a lot.
Oh, wow.
Peter, James, thank you so much for joining me. Stay with us, everybody. We got much more Black News Tonight coming up right after this.
It's like a fine wine. This really was. It's aged. It's full-bodied. But anyway, sorry, y'all want to hear James, see if James Lindsay sounds good in slow-mo. I don't know if he would lend himself to that, but we can find out. For science, everybody. We've never slow-mo James Lindsay.
And he, his ideology about nationalism and folkish ideology led to some pretty bad things in the early 20th century, and I'm kind of uncomfortable with you using that word. So should your speech now be curtailed? Because I'm uncomfortable with your fault.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fair dues, chat. That y'all were right about this one. This is drunk Lindsay is quite good.
Not even really racist connotation in its past. Over 100 years ago, long time no see, would be a translation from the Chinese. The idea that we're going to chill the way that people speak and that they can then lead to situations,
I agree, Stujins. It really does work with how expressive he is.
Situations in which they're being mobbed on social media and losing their livelihood because they don't necessarily have free speech under their employer. That's a really concerning development in society, and it's one that we actually should be taking seriously, especially since we're having extremism stand downs, for example, in the U.S. military. And we're seeing this kind of stuff taught in schools, which is being done by the state.
And one of the
oh, good stuff. Good stuff. Do you enjoy the Serfs but prefer not to have to use your eyeballs? Many are saying this. Well, we've got the solution for you. It's the Serf Times in podcast form. Available on most major podcasting networks now. If you enjoy it, please consider leaving a good review and feedback because it really helps the show out, apparently, and it's free, just like the podcast.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and Peyton L. Just, we are prepared to conduct many a human sacrifices in your honor. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we are but your humble yet incompetent jesters, trying in vain to bring some levity into your life. To our Lord Trevor R., we give you thanks for this meager plot of land for us to toil away our pathetic existence. To our brave knights, Carl Wauer, Tony, DM Rivera, Resident Scarecrow, Sir Nickus, Mayred, Cheryl Alvarez, Ruben Kelly, Brandon, Words Greenwood, Nate, Hagbird Celine, Matthew Scarborough, Stellar Vision, Ariane McCarthy, Daniel Sutton, Coulter Smith, Jenna Tal, Quiet 185, Anna Loves Riley, Omni, Riley and Anna, Poodlehawk, The Tim Caucus, Multimondi, Trevor Janis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojak, Saren 42, Catherine, Ramon Acosta, Nkosin, Agent NDN, Violent Orchard, Political Puppy, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We salute our mighty heroes off to conquest some bread in some far-off lands.